In this podcast, I'll go over the persistent accents in ancient Greek. These are the accents that are on the nouns, pronouns, and adjectives. For a full account of the accents, read carefully Unit 2 of Master Narde's Introduction to Attic Greek. You'll remember from the podcast on recessive accents that only the last three syllables, the antepenultima, the penultima, and the ultima, can carry an accent. In ancient Greek, there are three kinds of accents: the acute accent, the circumflex, and the grave. The acute can accent long or short vowels on any syllable. The circumflex can only accent long vowels and only on the second to last and the last syllable, that is the penultima and the ultima. And the grave can accent long or short vowels, but only on the last syllable, the ultima. Here's a diagram showing where the accents can go. You'll notice that the acute can be on the A, the antepenult, the P, the penult, and the U, the ultima. The circumflex can be on the P and the U, and the grave can be on just the U. For now, the only accents that concern us are the acute and the circumflex. So there are four basic rules that govern how words with persistent accents, that is nouns, adjectives, pronouns, will be accented as they are declined from the nominative to the genitive, dative, and accusative, and in the singular and plural. So rule number 1 is that persistent accents want to stay where they are in the nominative singular. In other words, they persist. In rule number 2, if the last syllable, the ultima, is long, it may cause the accent on the penult or antepenult syllable to move or change. If it moves, it'll move toward the last syllable. And we saw this with the acute recessive accent in the verbs. So when the ending was long, we saw that the accent moved from the antepenult to the penult. Rule number 3 applies to alpha eta declension nouns. And this rule overrides all others in this regard. So the rule is that alpha eta declension nouns always have a circumflex on the last syllable, on the ultima. So the fourth rule is the long-short rule, and this applies to the last two syllables, the penultima and the ultima, P and U. So when the penultima is accented and the vowel of the syllable is short, then the accent is an acute. When the penultima is accented and the vowel is long and the final syllable in the ultima is also long, then the accent on the penultima is also acute. But when the penult is accented and the vowel is long and the ultima vowel is short, the accent is a circumflex. So in other words, if we have a long penult followed by a short ultima and the penult is accented, it will be a circumflex. All other circumstances, it will be an acute. And so the first pattern is for the persistent acute accent on the ultima, the last syllable. All right, the first accent pattern follows the way the accents work in the declension of the neuter article. And so this is going to be the basis of the first pattern. So you'll notice then that the neuter article has an acute on the last syllable. It only has one syllable, so it's the last syllable. So it's acute in the nominative, circumflex in the genitive, circumflex in the dative, acute in the accusative, and then the pattern repeats in the plural. You have a acute in the nominative, circumflex in the genitive, circumflex in the dative, acute in the accusative. The pattern occurs no matter what the gender or whether the declension is omicron or alpha eta. As long as the final syllable has an acute, the pattern will be the same as it declines. So here we have potamos, which has a final syllable in acute, and it's masculine. And here we can see that it's acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute, acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute. As I mentioned before, the grave is just a transformation of the acute on the final syllable when another word follows. So here, declining the article with its noun gives us the opportunity to see what the grave looks like. So here we can see that wherever the article should take an acute, because the noun follows it, a grave is on the last syllable instead. Here we see the same pattern on the noun for dicastes and for thea. And in both cases, the article has a grave accent where it would normally take an acute. So we see acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute, acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute, regardless of whether it is an alpha, eta noun or an omicron noun. It's going to have this pattern. Pattern 2 is for the acute accent on the penultima. Here, the rule of thumb is that the accent will stay the same most of the time. So let's look at some examples. Starting with nosos, we can see that the accent stays the same as the noun is declined in all its cases. So the rule of thumb holds. So likewise with biblion, the rule of thumb holds. The acute on the penult is seen in all of the cases. However, when we move to doxa, which is an alpha eta declension noun, basic rule number 3 kicks in and overrides in the genitive plural, and there we get a circumflex over the omega of the last syllable. Here we have 2 alpha declension nouns, kora and gnome. And for the most part, the rule of thumb that the acute on the penultima will stay the same holds. The exceptions are where rule number 3 overrides. So in the genitive plural, we get a circumflex on the ultima because the rule number 3 is that genitive plurals of alpha or eta declensions take a circumflex. Rule number 4, that is the long-short rule, also overrides the rule of thumb in the nominative plural. We'll remember that for the purposes of accentuation, the diphthongs I and oi at the end of a word are treated as short. And so here, the nominative plural ending I is treated as short. And since the vowel of the penult is omega, therefore long, we have a long-short setup. And so that means that the accent has to change. The acute becomes a circumflex following the long-short rule. Here are another pair of alpha declension nouns. The masculine nouns nianias and stratiotes. In the singular, the rule of thumb mostly holds. However, in the plural, it's overridden by rule number 3, alpha eta nouns in the genitive plural take circumflex on the final syllable. So both neanion and stratioton have circumflex on the last syllable. Now in the case of stratiotai in the nominative plural and stratiota in the vocative singular, where the endings are short, rule number 4, the long-short rule, overrides the rule of thumb. And we get a circumflex instead of an acute. As pattern 3, circumflex on the penult. This pattern is based on the inversion of pattern 1. The deviations, as we'll see, are going to be largely caused by the fact that the differences between the neuter and the masculine and feminine endings trigger rule number 4, the long-short rule. So rule number 4, the long-short rule, is dominant in this pattern. Since we're dealing with the circumflex on the penult and the fact that circumflexes can only accent long vowels, it means that depending on whether the endings are long or short, the circumflex will either stay the same or change to acute. Here we can review pattern number 1, which is for the acute on the ultima. And there we see it's acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute, acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute. Now for pattern 3, the circumflex on the penult, we can look at the case of the neuter noun ployon, and the pattern is the inverse. Circumflex, acute, acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute, acute, circumflex. And we'll notice that when the case ending is short, the circumflex accent is on the penult. And when the case ending is long, the penult is accented with an acute. In the case of masculine omicron nouns, like sephos, the rule of thumb that the circumflex on the penult will have the inverse pattern of the accent on the neuter article. This is override by rule 4, that is a long-short rule. So wherever the quantity of the masculine case endings differ from the neuter, we'll see the deviation from the pattern. And so the nominative plural ending oi is short, and so the accent on the penult is a circumflex. And the accusative plural ending is long, and so the accent on the penult will be an acute. Pattern number 4, acute on antepenultima. The rule of thumb is that the acute accent on the antepenultima will move to the penultima when the ultima is long. And this we've already seen when we were looking at verbs, where we saw that the accent moved to the penult when the ending was long. Here we can see that the difference between a neuter noun like aition and a feminine alpha declension noun like thalata is caused by rule number 3. Genitive plurals of alpha eta declension nouns take a circumflex on the ultima, kicking in and overriding the rule of thumb. So whereas aition has an acute on the penult, thalaton has a circumflex on the ultima. Finally, let's turn to adjectives. In general, accents on omicron and alpha eta adjectives have the same accentuation as the nouns of the omicron alpha eta declensions. Now, the key exception for the adjectives is that rule number 3, that is that genitive plurals of alpha eta nouns have a circumflex on the ultima, doesn't apply since we're dealing with adjectives. The alpha eta adjectives aren't nouns, and so this is one way we can tell the difference between an adjective and a noun in the alpha eta declension is whether or not it has a circumflex in the genitive plural. Here we can see that in the genitive plural of axios, that the accent stays on the penult as an acute. However, if we look at agathos, the accent is on the ultima, and so the reason why we have circumflexes in the feminine is because of the fact that the accent was on the ultima to begin with, and so the circumflex will be there. So the best way to master the persistent accents is to memorize them as you learn the declension of the noun. So you should begin by grouping your nouns according to their accent in the nominative, and then you can break down each group into different declensions, omicron versus eta, and then according to gender, masculine, feminine,